All right, let's dive into something that's been making headlines, and I'm sure you've come across it. Deepfakes. You know those videos or audio clips that look and sound incredibly real, but they're actually manipulated. And for anyone aiming for the UPSC, staying updated on tech like this is, well, crucial, right? Today, we're taking a deep dive into a recent report from the Indian Express, specifically on how India is looking at regulating this whole deepfake situation.
Absolutely. Our goal is to break down the major concerns surrounding deepfakes, look at where India stands legally right now, and of course, what the future might hold in terms of regulation. Think of it as a focused analysis, zeroing in on what's important for your current affairs prep and grasping the broader societal impact of this technology, which is huge for the UPSC.
Definitely huge.
Hmm.
Okay, so starting with the basics. Deepfakes. Essentially, we're talking about AI being used to create super convincing forgeries, right?
Exactly. Imagine a video where someone appears to say or do something they never actually did. It's that realistic. And that's precisely where the potential for misuse comes in, which leads us to the key concerns being raised.
Makes sense. So what are the big red flags people are waving?
Well, MeitY, that's the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, recently presented a report to the Delhi High Court, and they outlined several major concerns. A really troubling one is the increase in deepfakes targeting women, especially during elections.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can see that's a big problem,
Right. It raises all sorts of ethical and societal questions tying into social justice and governance, which, as you know, are key topics in the UPSC syllabus.
for sure. And I guess it's not just about elections, right? What about the other concerns the report highlighted?
You're right. It also pointed out a rise in AI-driven scams, particularly after elections. This obviously raises concerns about things like economic offenses and national security, which, again, are big areas to be aware of for the UPSC.
It definitely seems like a tricky situation. So what's the thinking on how to actually tackle this? New laws specifically for deepfakes.
That's interesting, actually. The report actually emphasized strengthening how we enforce existing laws rather than immediately jumping to create new ones just for deepfakes. And this brings up a really important debate. Is the problem a lack of laws or just that we're not enforcing them effectively? A question that comes up a lot when we talk about governance.
That's a good point. And it makes you think, right? Where do you even start with regulations if there's no clear understanding of what a deep fake actually is?
Exactly. You've hit on another crucial point from the report. There's no universally accepted definition of deepfake. And without that, well, regulating it becomes a whole lot more complicated.
So no clear definition. What does that mean for the legal side of things in India?
Well, the first thing to note, and this is important for the UPSC folks out there, is that there's no specific law in India that directly deals with deepfakes.
So how are they addressing the issue legally then?
It's all about looking at how existing laws can be applied, and the report goes into detail on that. The Information Technology Act of 2000, the IT Act, is central here.
Okay, so the IT Act, how does that come into play with deepfakes?
Well, for example, Section 66D deals with cheating by impersonation using computer resources. So while it's meant for more traditional types of impersonation, it could potentially apply to deepfakes, especially when they're used for, say, financial fraud.
I see. Are there any other parts of the IT Act that are relevant?
Yeah, definitely. Section 66E, which is all about violation of privacy. Think about deepfakes being used to spread someone's private content without their consent. That's where this section could come in. And then there's Section 67, 67A, and 67B. These deal with obscene or sexually explicit material, which is especially relevant with the rise of deepfake pornography.
Right, those are obviously serious issues. But it's not just the IT Act, is it?
No, not at all. Defamation laws, the traditional ones, can also be used if deepfakes spread lies that damage someone's reputation.
So if a deepfake spreads false information and it harms someone, they could take legal action based on existing defamation laws.
Precisely. Then there's the whole area of intellectual property rights, which is another important angle.
And how does that play into it?
Well, the Copyright Act of 1957, specifically Section 51, might come into play. If a deepfake uses copyrighted material without permission, the owner could take legal action. This is particularly relevant for, let's say, commercially motivated deepfakes.
So even though there's no specific deepfake law, it seems like there are existing legal tools that can be used. Now, the Indian Express report also talked about petitions filed in the Delhi High Court. Can you give us some context on that?
Yeah, so there have been a number of petitions presented to the court, all basically asking for regulations on deepfakes and, more broadly, AI-generated content. 3 petitions stand out. The first was filed by Rajat Sharma.
I know that name. He's the editor-in-chief of India TV, right?
That's right. His petition basically argues for regulations on deepfake technology, even suggesting things like blocking access to apps that can create deepfakes. His main point is that deepfakes pose a huge threat to society by spreading misinformation, which of course can undermine democracy itself.
That echoes what MeitY was saying about election interference. What about the other petitions? What were their main points?
So another petition was filed by a lawyer, Chaitanya Rahila. His petition is broader, calling for regulations on the use of AI in general. He's worried about the risks that come with unregulated AI deployment.
The third one.
Right. The third notable petition is from Kanchan Nagar, a model. Her focus is specifically on non-consensual commercial deepfakes. She wants them banned and also argues for fair compensation for artists whose likeness or work is used in deepfake advertising.
It's interesting to see such a range of concerns being brought to the court's attention. Now, the report also mentioned MeitY forming a committee. When did that happen?
So after the Delhi High Court gave its instructions in November 2024, MeitY announced the committee on, I believe it was November 20th of that year. This 9-member committee was specifically tasked with tackling the whole deepfake challenge. They then met with various stakeholders on January 21st, 2025 to get their input.
So, consultations, gathering information. What came out of the government report after all that?
Well, the report basically reiterated those growing threats we talked about. Deepfakes targeting women during elections, the rise of AI-generated scams, and the disc problem of not having a universal definition for a deepfake.
Seems like those are the recurring themes, right? What about solutions? Did they talk about ways to address these problems?
Yeah, they did. Stakeholders stressed the need for several things in terms of regulating AI content, mandatory disclosure when AI is used to create content, clear labeling standards so people can identify AI-generated stuff, and effective ways for people to get help if they're affected by deepfakes. The focus seemed to be on tackling the harmful uses of deepfakes, not necessarily hindering creative or harmless uses.
It's all about drawing that line,
Yes.
right, between what's harmful and what's not. The report also brought up intermediary liability. What's that all about?
Yes. That's the whole question of online platforms, those acting as intermediaries, and how responsible they are for the content on their sites. MeitY's panel proposed making these intermediaries, like social media platforms, comply with certain requirements regarding deepfake content. But there was pushback from stakeholders who said, hold on, let's not just put all the burden on the platforms. Let's focus on better enforcement from the government side, too, instead of creating new regulations solely aimed at the platform.
Bringing that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between platform responsibility and government action.
Yeah, exactly. Someone from X, I think it was, specifically highlighted the need to distinguish between, let's say, deceptive AI-generated content and benign AI-generated content. Because not everything created with AI is harmful, right?
Yeah.
So any regulations need to be carefully thought out.
Makes sense. And the report also talked about the difficulty of actually detecting deepfakes. Seems like a big obstacle to actually combating them.
Absolutely. The Data Analysis Unit, which is part of the Meta-supported Misinformation Combat Alliance, pointed out several challenges. They're seeing deepfakes specifically targeting women during elections, and there's been a huge spike in AI-driven scams post-election. They also said audio deepfakes are proving really hard to detect. Their big takeaway was that we need more collaboration between organizations and standardized frameworks for detecting deepfakes.
So it's not just about laws, it's also about having the tech to spot these fakes. What about law enforcement? What role do they play?
So the Indian Cybercrime Coordination Center, I4C, has been tasked with collecting data on deepfake cases from law enforcement agencies across the country. Basically, they're trying to get a handle on how big this problem is. And the report mentioned things like awareness campaigns on platforms like YouTube to educate people about deepfakes.
Sounds like a multifaceted approach is key here. Where do things stand now, and what's next?
Well, MeitY has asked the Delhi High Court for 3 more months to finish its consultations. One interesting thing from the report is that they haven't actually consulted with deepfake victims directly yet, although they are working with the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting on that. One final observation. So far, discussions seem to be leaning towards reactive measures, dealing with deepfakes after they've been created. So this raises a question for our listeners, especially those prepping for the UPSC. What about proactive measures? How do we prevent this from becoming an even bigger problem?
It's definitely food for thought, especially with AI advancing so rapidly. To wrap up, especially for those UPSC aspirants out there, we've seen that India doesn't have specific laws for deepfakes yet, But existing laws like the IT Act, defamation laws, and copyright law could be used to address the harms. There are serious concerns about election interference, scams, and the whole difficulty of even defining deepfake. But there are efforts underway to tackle these issues, with committees being formed and consultations happening. And of course, the challenge of detecting these deepfakes is the big one.
It's a complex issue, that's for sure, and it touches on so many things. Governance, technology, ethics, society, all important for UPSC prep. It's dynamic, constantly evolving, so yeah, staying on top of this is key.
Absolutely. And this brings us to a final thought for all our listeners. Given how fast AI is moving, what are the best long-term solutions? Solutions that are effective in mitigating the risks, but also ethical. And how do we do all this while still encouraging innovation and protecting free speech? It's a big question, but one worth thinking about.
A huge question, definitely, and one that doesn't have easy answers.
If you found this deep dive helpful, especially if you're a UPSC aspirant, gearing up for the mains, and maybe even prelims, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with any questions you have. We'd love to hear from you. And for more info on this, check out the Indian Express article. They go into a lot of detail, which is always great for research.
Always good to dig deeper.
That's what we're here for. All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.